history, written history, is not fact. For many years, I believed it was. I believed anything I read about history, the West or whatever, it was fact. And then one day I was reading a Robert, because I've been a big fan of history all through my life, and I was reading a book by Robert Lacey about Henry Ford. And I've always been interested in motorcycles, cars, probably because my father was into vintage cars and motorcycles, and we've been in the vintage car club all our lives while we were with Dad. And I love the old, I love the Silver Ghost, Rolls Royce, and all those old Triumphs and Nortons and Harley Davidsons and Indians and all those old vehicles. And I was reading about the history of Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company, and Robert Lacey said in the book, it was one of those moments when everything comes together, where you don't think of something, and then all of a sudden you read something, and it's like, oh. And it was one of those moments, and he said something along the lines of, history is not fact, and something like it's depends on who writes. The victor always writes the history, something like that. What we don't realize is these days everyone reads and writes, but it wasn't always so. I was commenting with a female in America about 2-3 years ago on Facebook, and she said to me about the mental health system. She said, "Oh, but it's always been like this." And I read it and I thought, whoa. And what she was talking about was something that had been introduced in the last maybe 10, 15 years, well, up to that point. And or going back from when we were discussing it. And she had no idea that before she was able to comprehend life, that what she was debating, arguing with me about, didn't actually exist. It was only new. But to her, it had happened forever, for her whole life. So therefore she assumed it was like that since the beginning of time. We make that mistake, just like we all tend to make the mistake that we think that we're invincible. We can't have an car accident, we can't be broken, we won't die. People like to believe their parents are invincible. And so Robert Lacey said that history wasn't, it was written by the victor. So I did more research into that as the years went by, and I discovered, yes, it is. And like you could have a war between two huge countries and a massive battle, like the Battle of Waterloo or some such big battle, or a knight's battle, and only one person out of both sides could write. So they recorded the events. Now, on the loser's side, if that person who could write was on the loser's side, but was a sore loser, they would write down in history books that they won. And how easily they bet their opposition. If that was the only record found, then that's what we today would believe, and that's what would go into the education and the history books. The victor wrote the history normally, and they wrote it the way they saw it happen with their own prejudices, their own arrogance, ego, pride, etc., etc., etc. That all went into the writing. And what we read 5-10 centuries later is that. But it doesn't mean by any means that's what actually happened. And there are proven historical documents where people have written something and then it's been discovered it's completely wrong. But there's the other thing, like about gossip. You tell a story to one person that gets passed down to 5 people, and then the 5th person writes about it. And they write about it probably honestly as they hear it or heard it, but it's not exactly how it actually happened, because it's passed from person to person, and therefore from prejudice to ego, arrogance, or whatever, they add little juicy tidbits to it that never actually happened. Some people like doing that on purpose. They exaggerate the win. Like it could have been a close to a tie in a battle, but they'll exaggerate. One did win, but only just by the skin of their teeth. But it'll be written down historically as a great, overwhelming win for that side, and it wasn't. So when you realize that history was written that way, you see things differently. You can read about history with an open mind, looking out of the square. One of my videos here, history videos, said that the word forest was a town, either one or the other, forest or town, meant the opposite to each other. And if you said that the man was in the forest, or say it's the word forest, in medieval times, it actually meant he was in the town. But these days it means town, and it means forest out in the trees. So over the years, words have been changed, manipulated, and when you look at genuine 1500 text, it's very different from what we read today. So therefore it's translated, even if it's plain English, because it's not plain English as we have it today. And then you go back to Latin, which was used in other languages, and like the English language is French, and a whole lot of languages put together. You get an idea of how people can get it confused as to something that was written 5,000 years ago. It not only the people believed and felt and lived in a different way back then, and they may have written things down with feeling, but today, if the reader doesn't have the same feeling, they're not pulling the same thing out of the written text as was felt back then, and therefore they don't understand it, and it's translated in a certain way. It could be completely different from the truth. And then you've got to add in slang. Today we have the word gay, means homosexual, and there are other words like that. So you have a word and they say everyone in the town was gay today, and in 2,000 years' time they'll read it and say, oh, they were all happy. But it really means they were homosexual. So you get this giving words new meanings and then reading them hundreds of years later or thousands of years later, thinking they had the original meaning and it was completely different meaning. So history, written history, is not accurate. There were stages where only the monks wrote and no one else was able to write. So therefore, you had their particular view of what the event was. Written history is based on the writer, because the writer puts a certain amount of themselves into the written word. Another thing that I read about a few famous people that they said were either homosexual or they were bad, evil people, etc., etc. Now, open your mind up and realize that people today can forge a signature. So say a famous person died in the year 100, but they had an enemy between the year 100 and the year 200 or 150, sat down, forged a signature, and wrote some books supposedly by that person. Then they just went and put them with that person's text, say at a library or wherever it was kept. And they said, oh, this is some more of their stuff. And they'll check it and say, well, it's their handwriting, it's their signature, so it must be part of it. And they put it in, and it's scandalous. 2,000 years later, we read it and we're like, oh my gosh, he tried to murder the president or the pope or whatever. So you get that sort of thing as well. Then, if you look with a more open mind, you realize that people who had money could pay off the scribes, the people who wrote stuff down, the historians. And they said, look, we will give you a small fortune if you will change this. And so they changed it. It was known in the, I mentioned a few times before, in the year 300, I think it was, there was many versions of the book of Matthew from the Bible. And each town, they were used like sermons, and each town, the wealthy who went to church would pay the preachers to change the text according to their sins. And if the wealthy person who gave a lot of money to the church had a particular sin they liked, they made sure it was removed from the text. And they would say, please don't ever preach about that. And so, and the wealthy person may have even had enough power to oust the preacher in some scandal. So the preacher didn't have to, but could obey what they were told, rewrite the text, and then tell everyone it's the gospel truth from God. So things were adjusting. The impression with John the Baptist when he stood up and spoke about how they were doing bad when he could have been bribed to shut up, and he didn't. So people can bribe people to change history and to rewrite things in a different way. And, so history's not accurate. The further back it goes, the less accurate it is. And sometimes you can get many different versions. And a good example for the Bible is the four Gospels. And you've got them not connecting, they're contradicting. And I was told the reason for that is because it's like four people in a car accident. They tell their different versions. There's another version called Q, and it was supposed to be one written down in Q, and the four Gospel writers, or the three of the Gospel writers, read it and then put it in their Gospels with variations according to where they lived and what the beliefs were in that particular area. So a lot of people were changing Christianity to suit their cause, the local beliefs, the sins of the town, etc., etc. The same with normal history. You have, in secular history, you have kings and queens, and you have all the scandals. I've read some stuff that's like, it's just shocking what people will do to other people. Cruelty, the way they execute people. And there also, you'll find with history, there are long periods of time where there's peace. But because with your newspaper, everyone wants to hear the bad news, because bad news or gossip is exciting. So we get a lot of focusing on the bad times, and no one wants to know about the 100 years of peace between countries because it's boring. And unless you're actually studying how they lived and what they ate and how they cooked and the local politics of that time, you're not interested in 100 years of peace. But if there was a particular battle for a particular reason, that was more interesting. So you also have people deliberately ignoring certain events because there was nothing in their view that was interesting about those events or those periods of time. Plus, on top of it, I have an old history book of Egypt and the like, and they admit quite readily there were kings and queens in times where things happened And they readily admit there were hundreds of years between events where there is no documented history of what happened in those gaps. They're just big, huge gaps. And they say, we know what happened before that 100 years, we know what happened after that 100 years, but during that period of time, there's no surviving written history. So we have absolutely no idea um, who may have been the king or queen of that period, what the laws passed were, what happened, the politics, the religions. We know nothing at all, zero. And so therefore, all we can do is jump to the next part. And in a history book, they might just admit that they don't know about it and just carry it on like it's a straight line of history. And it's not. There are gaps missing. And this book clearly states that there are many missing gaps in that particular, through those centuries. So you have that sort of thing as well. When you go to school or you go to the library, you read the encyclopedias or the history books and they study history, many teachers who would have had the same view I had in the past, where it was written, it was history, and it's a well-known fact, then it's the truth. One of the big halves of history was Columbus. It wasn't until I homeschooled my children that I discovered what a horrible man he was. Prior to that, everyone, they had Columbus Day in America, everyone raved about the great Columbus discovery in America, and he didn't. And I read about how an entire Indian tribe committed suicide because he was going in there threatening them, and I think he was actually killing some of them to get gold to take back to Spain to the Queen. So he was a horrible man, Columbus was, and he did horrible things to the natives on the lands where he landed because he had to take gold or precious coins or whatever back to the Queen to pay for the trips he was on. And he would go to the extent of killing and torturing people to do it. So he was not a nice man, but all through the years I taught my children that he was, until one day we sat down and done a really real in-depth study. And I realized all the years at school here in New Zealand, I'd been taught what a great man Columbus was a lie. And the school teachers didn't know any better. I didn't know any better until I did an internet study on it with my children, and then I was very shocked. Since then, I've discovered other people the same thing. Also, on top of that, we have this new thing where probably more liberal governments are rearranging the local history. In New Zealand, our history has been changed. There was a Maori chief who was a very horrible man. He was compared with Hitler for the evil things that he did. And I found on a website about 10 years ago, I think it was, there was a website with the great Maori chiefs, because I was trying to get the young Maori people to believe in their past. He was up there as a great Maori warrior for the young people to admire, etc., etc. So what they'd done was they were changing their past and making them look good. I was in contact with a Japanese teacher in Japan for quite a few years, and we would exchange information and the like. And he was telling me in Japan, many Japanese teachers were fighting the government for the right to teach the Second World War and Japan's part in the Second World War to the children of Japan as a lesson. And the government was refusing the teachers the right to do that. It's in the 1990s. So you have that sort of situation too. Plus you have Andrew Carnegie in the year early 19, it was about 1910 maybe. He got a whole lot of library. He was a multimillionaire, and he got a whole lot of libraries built all around the world. There's one in Rotorua here in New Zealand. I saw it years ago. It was very old, and it was been shut down, but they still had the plaque on the wall, and I read it, and it said donated by Andrew Carnegie. And what he did as a millionaire was a commercialist, capitalist. He got, along with other very rich people, they got libraries built with books put into it. Those libraries put in every single or in many towns all around the world, America, and many other places like Australia, New Zealand, and Europe, with certain books in them, and the books had a certain history in them, and they were said to be the history of the world. And I'm very dubious about that particular history because if you wanted people to believe in commercialism, capitalism, and all the things that he believed in, and he paid for the libraries and paid for the books to go into the libraries, the teachers and the schools and the towns would have been so grateful to him, they would have seen it all as the gospel truth. Another part about history is that when Hitler was in power, and many other leaders have done this, especially capitalists, is they burn the history or the books that they don't want the people to read, especially any bad history about them. And religious groups have been known to do the same thing. If they've done something really bad in the past to get their land or to overtake other people, to spread their particular version of religion with violence, whatever, they will omit that from their history or their universities and the like. So therefore their history is not true, it's not real, it omits certain things. So it's like telling the truth and omitting the full truth. So you have people giving history, official history, religiously or in government or education or wherever, based on their beliefs and based on what they want you to know. And history can be used to convince you to make the future something if you're only taught to read certain religious history books that will point you in a certain direction mentally, and like all the books on the great wonders of commercialism, the great expedition in England in the 1800s. It was 1850, and so you've got this great desire to see expansion in industry, growth, money, etc., etc. And then you get this large focus on commerce, buying and selling, and then you see the great wonders of all this, when in reality it's leading you to a 9 to 5 life of working, and where we naturally, were the people of the last 100 years naturally wanting to bring in the system, or were they coerced into it, brainwashed through the books that Andrew Carnegie and the like gave out? It's up to you to decide. The thing here is that whatever you read in written history, it is wise to keep an open mind about its authenticity, about its being fact or fiction, and not to see it as the gospel truth every time you read a book about history, because, and that's the same as watching documentaries now on TV or buying documentaries, DVDs. And a good one, which is kind of blended with science, is evolution, where they say, I saw one on the Discovery Channel, the whale was in the water and it grew legs because it wanted to eat what was on the tree. So it grew legs, it came out of the water, and then it climbed the trees, lived in the trees for a period of time, then decided to come back down, lose its legs, and go back into the water as something else, or something along those lines. And all these theories sound wonderful, but when you actually sit down and say, where are the skeletons of the whale with its first legs? They don't exist. Where are the skeletons of the whales when they changed into whatever it was that climbed the trees? They don't exist. Now, if the proof's not there, then they call it the history of the earth. The other one is humans turning to monkeys turning to humans. The middle part's missing, skeletons, the proof. And so you see the pictures of the monkey turning into the man and the man standing up straight and walking. The bits in the middle don't exist, there are no skeletons. So there's no actual proof. They're just saying that's what happened. So, and they're saying that's true history. And the thing here is and I'm not saying that evolution is a lie, I'm just saying that if there's no proof of it, and even though titled, educated, said to be wise scientists and educators tell you that it is real, if there is no proof, and there never has been any proof of it ever actually happening, it should be ignored. And well, at least have an open mind. And if you're teaching children, say to them, well, look, there's actually never been proof for this. We're just reading it, looking at a video that says this is what happened. There is no harm in you believing that this is only a suggestion. It's not a fact. So if we keep an open mind about history and realize that it's not always, a lot of it's never ever been actually proven, and if it has, who wrote it? Did they have an agenda? Were they politically biased in a certain way, or were they religiously biased in another way? Were they prejudiced? And if there was only one writer in England in one 10-year period, then all the written history is by that one person, which could be heavily biased in certain directions. So therefore, you've got to take a bit of a, you've got to take, how would you put it? You take a view that it may not be correct. It may not be absolutely correct, but it could be seen as a guide. And a lot of it's not important anyway. But if you see it as history as a guide, written history as a guide, and you realize that it could be faulty, that's fine. It doesn't have to be absolute truth anyway, because today's today, back then is back then. But it is a good guideline of what could have happened, and in some cases, definitely what did happen, and so forth like that. So written history is not fact, no matter where you read it, or no matter where you read it from. Even 50 years ago, there are events that, if you find there are many different versions to one event, that different people saying different things happened. So who's telling the truth? Or are they all telling the truth from a different perspective, a different angle, a different view? And how were they feeling on that day anyway? Were any of them suffering mental illness and stuff like that? So it's, or stress or depression or suicidal thoughts that particular day when they wrote something, or were they grieving? So there's a lot of things to take into consideration when you're thinking about history, and it's whether it's fact or not. It's just things to think about.